Hey there Retro Games fans, this is Andy C from Piece of 8-Bit. Welcome to another video related to our month with the Dreamcast. Now last week we stepped into an alternate timeline and we indulged ourselves with the question, what if Sega had stuck around as a console manufacturer? And I thought it was a pretty fascinating thought experiment. It was kind of long, I apologise for that, but please do go check it out if you get a second, or quite a lot of seconds actually, and let me know your thoughts on maybe what a Dreamcast 2 might have looked like, or what it might have looked like in 2026. This week though, mercifully, we are keeping things a little shorter and a little lighter. Now the Dreamcast only had a lifespan of about 3 years, but in that short time Sega packed it full of ideas that were way ahead of the competition. Some were pretty revolutionary, some were quite quirky, a few quietly were reshaping the future of gaming as we know it today. And I think in many ways a lot of it didn't really get the credit it deserved. So let's go back and get our Dreamcast powered up. Let's plug in that 56k modem, yeah maybe not, and let's count down 10 things about the Sega console that you may have known about, you might have forgotten about, or maybe you just didn't know about at all. Let's dive in and have a look. Okay, so first up is something that I think probably most people know now, and that is that the Dreamcast was really the first truly connected console. Now we expect every console, every computer that we own to connect to the internet these days for gaming. We download games, we stream movies, we chat with friends, we browse online, and we don't really give it a second thought. It's just natural to expect it now. But back in 1998 that idea was pretty futuristic, but Sega, they were looking ahead. They decided that every Dreamcast should ship with a modem built in as standard. Japanese consoles included the 33.6k modem, whilst in Europe and North America we received the super speedy 56k modem. Now, of course, this was the era of dial-up internet, so every minute online tied up your home phone line. Broadband was pretty much unheard of, and if someone in the house picked up the phone, then your evening was ruined and your connection would disappear instantly. Never was a call from your Auntie Maureen so disruptive to your life. But despite all of that, Sega fully embraced this future of internet gaming. So with games like Choo Choo Rocket, Quake 3 Arena, Phantasy Star Online, and it all allowed players from around the world to compete and cooperate online years before Xbox Live or PlayStation Network even existed. And they didn't stop there, because through services like Dream Arena, SegaNet, some games could download new content, updated player data, ghost laps, special events. Arguably the earliest examples of downloadable content on a home console, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, the Dreamcast even had a full-featured web browser. You could surf the web, send emails, chat online. You could plug in a keyboard and mouse as well and turn your Dreamcast into a pretty capable, surprisingly good internet machine. Looking back at that now, it's pretty remarkable just how many modern console features Sega was experimenting with more than 25 years ago. It's just, whilst the technology wasn't quite ready, Sega's vision for it absolutely was. And when I talk about the technology, I don't mean the Dreamcast technology, I mean the technology that you plug in to make it all amazing and great that we expect today. Okay, that's our first one. Let's go and have a look at our second entry. Now today we hear about blockbuster games costing hundreds of millions of pounds to develop. Grand Theft Auto famously costs an inordinate amount of money to produce. But back in 1999, one game completely changed expectations, and that game was Shenmue. It was developed by legendary Sega designer Yu Suzuki, and Shenmue reportedly cost somewhere between, get this, $47 and $70 million to produce. And that made it comfortably the most expensive video game that was ever made at the time. And for that, the level of ambition was astonishing. Fully voiced characters, a living town with day and night cycles, weather effects, NPCs following daily routines, hundreds of interactive objects, and cinematic storytelling unlike anything players had ever experienced before. It introduced ideas that later would become standard in games like Grand Theft Auto, but also Yakuza and even some modern open world RPGs. And whilst Shenmue itself arrived a few months after launch, it perfectly demonstrated what the Dreamcast was going to be capable of throughout its life. In fact, the Dreamcast launched with one of the strongest launch lineups anyway in gaming history, some 18 games. Depending on the region, players could enjoy titles such as Soul Calibur, Sonic Adventure, Power Stone, Hydro Thunder, NFL 2K, Ready to Rumble Boxing, House of the Dead 2, and many, many more. So it wasn't short of great games. It just struggled to convince people to buy the consoles to play on them. Okay, so ask any Dreamcast fan what 9999 means to them, and they will probably give you a little wry smile. And that's because Sega's North American launch was on September the 9th, 1999. And that date wasn't just memorable because of the date, it was memorable because it was one of the biggest console launches that gaming had ever seen up to that point. Sega really leaned into the marketing, everything around that launch, making that date a truly unforgettable date. Pretty easy anyway, because it's 5 nines. The gamble almost paid off. More than 225,000 Dreamcasts were sold within the first 24 hours in North America and generated around $98 million of sales. And it set a new entertainment launch record at the time. Retailers, in fact, even struggled to keep up with the demand, and for a brief moment, it genuinely looked like Sega had pulled off one of gaming's greatest comebacks after the troubled Saturn before it. Unfortunately, we all know what happened next. The PS2 was waiting in the wings around the corner, and you know, if you go back and watch my video, you'll understand all about that history of where the failure was, not just the PS2, I might add, but for that one day in September 1999, the Dreamcast, for just a brief moment, was the hottest property in gaming. So this next one is probably one again that you will probably know if you're a Dreamcast owner, but the VMU, or the Visual Memory Unit, is actually one of the most imaginative gaming accessories I think that's ever been made. Officially, it was just a memory card, but in reality it had its own little LCD screen, it's got its own little processor, buttons, batteries, and even a tiny little speaker. During gameplay, it displayed information like your health bars or secret data, play selections, mini-maps, all sorts of things like that without cluttering up your TV screen. And then you could remove it from the controller and you could carry it around with you, take it to your mates' houses and play on their Dreamcast. Games like Sonic Adventure let you raise your little Chow creatures, a bit like Tamagotchis, whilst you're away from the console before transferring them back into the main game when you got home. It wasn't quite a full-fledged Game Boy, but it's amazing to think that Sega built a little miniature handheld like this big into every memory card all the way back in 1998. So this next one is a little bit of an own goal, actually, on Sega's part, and probably one of Sega's biggest mistakes. So rather than using standard CDs in the Dreamcast, or DVDs for that matter, the Dreamcast used something called a GD-ROM, which is capable of storing around 1 gigabyte of data, which is almost twice that of a standard CD. Pretty impressive stuff. And it sounded pretty secure, actually. But Sega also left support enabled for something called MIL-CD, M-I-L-C-D, designed for enhanced multimedia discs. And unfortunately, hackers quickly realised that you could exploit that feature to boot copied games without modifying the hardware at all. Unlike many consoles of the era, you didn't need a mod chip, you just burned the game correctly onto a CDR and many Dreamcasts would just load it. And it became one of the biggest security oversights in gaming history, and it undoubtedly hurt software sales during Sega's already difficult final years in the hardware business at a time when the game sales were the thing that they really, really needed to get right. Yeah, bit of an own goal that one, Sega. Does make life a little bit easier these days, that said, if you want to play some games from backup, of course. Let's have a look at the next section. Now, this next one is one that I'd only just realised as part of doing the research for the month with, and that is that Sega's hardware in the Dreamcast was very similar to its arcade hardware. Now, Sega had always been the king of the hardware, so when it came to designing the Dreamcast, they took a pretty clever approach. So rather than building something completely different, what they did was they based it on the NAOMI arcade board, which was in so many of their cabinets at the time. And that meant that developers could move games very easily between the arcade and the game and the home with relatively little effort. It's why games like Crazy Taxi, Virtua Tennis, House of the Dead 2, Dead or Alive 2 and Marvel vs. Capcom all felt pretty identical to the machines that you'd been feeding pound coins or quarters into just weeks earlier. In 1999, that was a pretty cool achievement, and for many people buying a Dreamcast, it really did feel like bringing the arcade home, something which I think Sega almost must have been banking on, which is this idea that is how they were going to make their sales. It's how console manufacturers have done it in the past, especially in the 80s, where you would buy a console because you played the games in the arcade. And I think Sega were kind of betting the ranch a little bit that people were going to do the same thing in the late 90s as well. I think probably because the arcades were starting to die out a little bit then as well. I think that probably didn't help. But there you go. Let's have a look at the next section. Now, this next one is probably one that quite a few people might have spotted. They might have spotted the odd Microsoft logo over there around on their Dreamcast or on some of their games, and that is because Microsoft helped to build part of the Dreamcast. Now, Microsoft and Sega actually worked pretty closely together during the Dreamcast development. Windows created a version of Windows CE, their compact edition of Windows, which you saw on PDAs back in the day. That was developed for the console, which gave PC developers a familiar development environment, and that ultimately made porting games a little bit easier. Not every developer chose to use it, I might add. Many accessed the hardware directly for maximum performance, but it lowered the barrier for studios moving from PC to console development. It's quite funny when you look back at it now. Just a couple of years later, Microsoft, of course, would launch the Xbox into the same generation, the console that inherited many former Dreamcast fans after Sega left the hardware business. In a strange way, I think Microsoft's first console owes a tiny part of its history to Sega's last, and you will hear a lot of people say that the Xbox is a little bit of a spiritual successor to the Dreamcast, and that Microsoft really picked up where Sega left off. Now, this is one that often gets levelled at the door of why the Dreamcast failed. It nearly included DVD playback, and this is one criticism that did follow the Dreamcast throughout its life, and that was that it didn't have a DVD player. It became one of Sony's biggest weapons when the PlayStation 2 launched, but Sega had already looked at DVD technology during development, and the problem came down to one thing, which was money. A little bit early in the DVD life cycle, so it was still quite an expensive technology to adopt. After the commercial struggles of the Saturn, Sega desperately needed the Dreamcast to launch an attractive price. Including DVD hardware at the end of the 90s would have made the console significantly more expensive. Sony could afford to absorb those costs, and of course it was a few years later as well, so the hardware was already a little bit cheaper. Sega just didn't have the time or the money to do that, and it's impossible to know whether DVD playback could have potentially saved the Dreamcast. It certainly would have been bad for it, and it certainly would have removed one of the PlayStation 2's biggest selling points. Yeah, another one of those little what ifs there for sure. We'll never know. Now, this next one is a fun one, because actually I'd never really thought about it before, and I'd seen Dreamcast logos, and I'd seen the sort of orangey red one, and I'd seen the blue one, and I even remember somebody talking about the red Dreamcast logo and me correcting them and saying, no, it's blue. And the reason for that is that the famous Dreamcast swirl isn't always red or blue. And this is one for all the collectors out there. Depending on where you bought your Dreamcast, that famous Sega swirl isn't actually the same colour in Japan and North America. It's red. In Europe, it's blue. Why? Well, because a German software company already owned the rights to a very similar red swirl logo across parts of Europe. So rather than spend years fighting a trademark battle, Sega simply just changed the colour. Basically, I think it's red for NTSC and blue for PAL. Think of it that way. It's a tiny detail that many owners, myself included, never really notice, but once you've seen it, you'll never unsee it. Let's go and have a look at the final point. So this last one I think is quite a nice point to end on before we go and grab my final thoughts on all of this. Now, officially, with the use of air quotes, the Dreamcast died in 2001. Unofficially, on the other hand, I would say it is still very much alive and kicking. More than 25 years later, a quarter of a century later, developers are continuing to produce brand new games for the Dreamcast. Now, some of them are digital releases. Others, on the other hand, arrive as beautifully produced physical editions with proper cases, manuals and accompanying artwork. On top of that, the hardware itself has never been easier to own. There's modern HDMI modifications, replacement power supplies, optical drive emulators and SD card solutions that have transformed the experience of owning a Dreamcast in 2026. There are very few consoles that receive this level of support decades after production has ended. So whilst the Dreamcast itself may have failed commercially, I think there are very few consoles out there that have earned such passionate loyalty from their fans. So yes, there you go. That was my final point. Hopefully that was useful. Let's go and grab my final thoughts on all of this and wrap up for this week. Alright then, just my closing remarks on this then. So there you have it. 10 maybe surprising facts about one of gaming's most fascinating consoles. The more time I've spent with the Dreamcast this month, the more I've realised just how far ahead of its time actually it really was. Not every idea was a success, this is Sega, remember, but so many of the things that we now take for granted in 2026 were just being explored by Sega back in 1998. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. Same as last week's thought experiment on the what if. What if they'd survived? Would we still see that level of innovation? Would we have just been putting things off? Go check out my video on that if you've got a spare hour to look at it. There's chapters in there, so you can skip through those if you want to as well. Love your thoughts on that. But let me know your thoughts on this as well. Is there anything else surprising about the Dreamcast that perhaps I've missed? Any other interesting facts or things that you think I've missed? Please do drop a note in the comments below. Really do appreciate your feedback and thoughts on all of these things as well. You probably noticed that I haven't been getting to the comments as much as I usually do. It's just been an incredibly busy time for me at the moment. I've got a lot going on, and I'm just trying to find the time to get the videos made and edited as well, let alone get to everything. But I will get to comments as well. I'm not ignoring you, I promise. I do read all of the comments that I get, so thank you so much for your support and time taken to interact with me on all of that. We are obviously getting very close to the end of the month now for the Dreamcast, so I will, of course, next week be telling you what it's been like to live with the Dreamcast for the last 4 weeks. And I will also be talking, well, throughout that video, I'll be talking a little bit about the history, the hardware, what games I've been playing, and how you can get back into Dreamcast gaming in 2026. And then I will be revealing what is coming up next month for the month in August. And of course, there will be some bit-betweens to go with that once I've announced that as well. Next week, I'll be looking at Metropolis Street Racing in the bit-between, so it's the last game I've got for the bit-between in the Dreamcast month as well. So please do go check that out. That's a fantastic game. Really enjoyed playing that, so it'd be great to share that with you as well. I think that is about it for this week. So yeah, if you do enjoy these videos, of course, please do hit that like and subscribe button. Really do appreciate your support. Hit the bell icon as well, of course. Again, you know why. Yes, for those of you who don't know why, it gives you the notifications so you don't miss any content. And it probably just leaves me to say thank you all for watching. Please do take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, bye for now.